All right. Welcome if you've just joined us. Going to go ahead and kick us off here as we have a ton of content to get through in just an hour with everybody today. But excited that you all made it, excited that you're here. And I know, speaking for myself and for my colleagues, Liz, Rhiannon, and Billy, and the rest of the Lifelines team, we are super excited to be introducing this EO guide for humanitarian decision makers that's been in the works for about a year now. So excited to kind of do a launch today with you all and introduce some of the content. I'm going to go ahead and start us off with a little bit of an agenda, just so you guys know what to expect throughout today. We're going to kind of start with a quick welcome, and I'll give a little bit of a background context to NASA Lifelines. I know many of the folks on the line are familiar names, and so a lot of this information might be a little bit of a repeat, but just to get everybody on the same page. So I'll touch to Lifelines, and then I'll introduce the guide, the humanitarian guide, and we'll kind of work through a couple of different sections. The first one being the framework exploration, which is kind of the kind of core component of the guide, and then I'll pass it over to a couple of the fellows to speak to some case studies applying that framework and the guide to flood early warning systems, human rights, and then we'll kind of conclude with a bit of a discussion and some involvement from the audience at the end. To kind of start us off, as I mentioned, speaking a little bit to NASA Lifelines. So launched in October of 2023, NASA Lifelines is a series of community building experiments designed to bring together humanitarians, scientists, policymakers, frontline communities, and others to accelerate the use of satellite data and tools in support of our most vulnerable communities and unlock benefits of satellite data before, during, and after humanitarian crises. So why? NASA and our community feel that there is still significant unrealized potential for Earth science to help humanitarians save lives and reduce human suffering. Today, there are over 5,000 humanitarian organizations globally serving 362 million people who are currently experiencing humanitarian emergencies. Only 1% of humanitarian aid budgets go towards innovation. We believe we can do better and that we must do better. One other one is 500 humanitarian applications are already powered by Earth science, and this number is growing for satellite data and tools to be applied across sectors and geographies. So what needs to happen for humanitarians to use more Earth science? These are a few things that we are hearing from the community. First and foremost, it's about awareness building and not just knowing that it's there and that it's a valuable tool, but knowing how to take advantage of it. Folks don't know what resources to tap into, what data sets map into their use cases, don't know who to partner with. Secondly, they also need access to expertise. In-house capacity to work with satellite and other geospatial data in many humanitarian organizations is minimal. Also, folks need fit for purpose Earth science. That means that they need data, tools, models, and trainings that are designed for humanitarian contexts and designed with their purposes in mind. The environments that they operate in are fast-paced. These are complex crises and oftentimes low bandwidth environments. We need to take into account who we are creating these tools for. And then finally, about partnerships to be able to adopt and scale. So to address some of these things, awareness, access to expertise, fit for purpose science, our team, led by two of our fellows, have been working over the last year to develop a practical guide to help humanitarian decision makers determine if and how to work with satellite data and tools. The guide doesn't get into the nitty-gritty of all of the applications, of all the satellite applications in the humanitarian sector, data types, resolution considerations, and so forth. And I'd actually point you to Caribou Space's Beyond Borders report to do a much more in-depth dive into all of that. What our guide does is provide a structured framework of key questions and studies and case studies demonstrating real-world applications. This guide provides a repeatable method and community examples to allow decision makers to make informed choices. Questions to consider range from evaluating the benefits and risks of satellite data to understanding and ethical considerations, cost implications, and capacity requirements. Beyond technical guidance, this resource also helps organizations assess that expertise needed to work with geospatial data, manage expectations about data accuracy and limitations, and ensure that satellite-driven insights align with humanitarian principles. So as I already kind of touched on, this guide is designed to help the humanitarian decision maker. This looks like information management officers, technology advisors, program managers, and others, and helps them determine if and how to work with satellite data and tools. This guide is an entry point for any humanitarian decision maker who is ready to improve their outcomes using satellite data. On this slide are a couple of goals and challenges that you can kind of read through on your own that decision makers are grappling with. And we sourced this from our community survey and some stakeholder interviews that we did early on in this process. And now with that, I'll pass it over to my colleague Rhiannon to speak a little bit to the suitability assessment framework and kind of the bones of a lot of this guide. Over to you, Rhi.
Thanks so much, Seamus, and thank you everybody for joining us today. It's really great to see y'all, and I'm really excited to share what we got here in terms of the guide. As Seamus noted, one of the kind of key resources that's a component of this is really a suitability assessment framework. And that is a kind of fancy term, but really what we are offering are a series of questions and considerations at each stage of a project lifecycle to really determine if satellite data and tools are fit for purpose for your needs as a humanitarian decision maker. And if so, how do you go about unlocking the value for your organization and your communities that you're trying to serve in the here and now? And so what we really try to do are offer up what are the most relevant questions for you to consider at each phase along the way. But I will say a few important kind of caveats before I walk you through pieces of the framework here. One, this is very much a living framework, and you'll see this as Liz and Billy present the case studies, which are really just the beginnings of us, hopefully as a community, pressure testing this resource, start understand where is it relevant for your needs versus where is it perhaps just a helpful reference at times. And so think of this as something that we can drive together. Also think of it as like I mentioned, a kind of reference sheet and something that you can refer to, but not as a set of instructions per se. It's not a kind of check the box type exercise. It really is meant to be something that you can almost have as a sanity check along the way, just to make sure that you have a resource and kind of know that you are, along with your partners, along with technical experts, going in the right direction at least. And so with that, I think one of the other important things that we would emphasize, and this was a really important part of our process too, is the human-centered design elements, both of the framework itself and in terms of how you should use this. So one, we very much recommend that you center affected communities as much as you can throughout all of these considerations. And we've tried to also help you do that in terms of how we frame things. And then I'd also very much do this in partnership. And so a lot of the questions that we're tackling are things where there's an ever evolving technology landscape. One person, a few people cannot, realistically keep up with everything that's going on. And so we need community and we need partnership if we're going to do this smartly. And so that's one of the other things that we would really highlight and are really paramount to getting the value that you could as a decision maker out of a resource like this and out of satellite data writ large. And then last but not least, before I walk through some of the framework itself, we cannot emphasize enough evaluation and learning, especially to inform scaling and to be able to share what works and what doesn't with the community. So again, going back to let's, figure out what works, but let's experiment in ways that are thoughtful and intentional. But let's also invest in the things that are working and do it collectively, so we're not duplicating efforts and not taking advantage of all the incredible open science that's already out there. And so just a few things, a few caveats, if you will, before I jump into things. But I'll talk about the kind of first component here of the framework, which is really about whether or not satellite data and tools are fit for purpose for your needs. And so you'll see here within the framework, we've kind of phased it out so that you have really clear considerations at each stage. So you've also got a key here where we've noted some of the considerations that we have deemed to be mission critical. And the legend here, or the orange kind of beginnings of each consideration, those are the mission critical ones. The other ones are kind of nice to have. They may or may not be relevant in certain cases. But really, in terms of defining your requirements, engaging community in terms of defining those assessing those needs and defining requirements, and how satellite data can support doing some of the landscaping as well to make sure that you're not duplicating what's already out there or taking advantage of the ingredients that already exist. These are some of the pieces that you'll find in this section, and are some of the considerations that you can work through with your team and with others as well. On the next section, this really gets into more on the scoping. So once you've decided phase one that satellite data and tools are fit for purpose, you have a sense of the lay of the land and what's out there, what you might be able to take advantage of, where you might need to build or partner and figure out your own methods. Here's where you really start to refine some of that and figure out, what does that look like? Where can you take advantage of what exists? Where do you have to create? What ground truthing and validation exist? What are your expectations in terms of what you could accomplish with the data and with the tools for your use case, as well as really critical questions around what kind of skill sets, what kind of partnerships would be necessary to actually implement this and do the work. And so it starts to kind of walk you through questions at each of those, as well as gives you nods to, consider these kinds of existing communities of practice, consider these kinds of in-kind resources that are really geared towards this part of your project lifecycle, or your particular methods, etc. And then the last phase is really geared towards sharing and communicating results. But as I kind of mentioned when I was starting to kind of frame some of the caveats around this, this also includes a lot of things that are, we think, mission critical in terms of the building blocks for scaling and for kind of seeding success for other teams across your organization or your partners or the communities on the ground to take ownership of some of this even. And so really starting to document, adopt clear methods, to communicate what works and what doesn't, to take the time to share that out is really important, as well as doing, again, a lot of the reflection and evaluation at the end of the project life cycle, which can then hopefully inform a lot of the next steps and where you go in terms of a broader strategy or a broader investment in some of these things too. So that is a very quick nutshell of the framework and some of the questions. I'm going to hand it over to Liz, since she's going to really introduce our case studies and the two that we've really at least started to pressure test. And I want to say a big thanks to Liz and to Billy as well for really fantastic work in terms of really wrangling what is can be a lot of big, vague questions that many of us have spent careers tackling and making it really digestible for us. So big round of applause for our fellows for doing a fantastic job. And also I want to say a big thank you to all of those of you who helped us pressure test and hone this along the way, which we'll get into more at the end. But Liz, over to you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Great. So Billy and I, pressure tested these two use cases into the framework and answered some questions. So what we'll do is take you through a few questions, not all, that's all in the guide. So please do read that, that we thought were particularly interesting. And I'll talk about how I'll answer those questions for flood early warnings. And then Billy will talk about how she's answering those for human rights. So just to give a brief introduction, we both are, or I guess we're just finishing up our Lifelines fellowship. We've been fellows for the last year. And thanks again for everyone who's helped with this and pressure tested this guide. So to start with flood early warning systems alert residents to incoming hazards and help communities to evacuate high-risk areas, and ultimately the goal is to save lives. So effective end-to-end early warning systems have these 4 key components: disaster risk knowledge, a warning service, communication and dissemination, and response capability. And they're characterized by being multi-hazard, comprehensive from detection to action, and people-centered, empowering communities to effectively act and reduce harm. So Earth observation can support this along many different steps of the ways, and that's all in the guide, and we'll talk about some of those ways. They can allow for rapid and precise warnings to enable timely evacuations and protections of assets. And humanitarian organizations can support the development of these systems and leverage these forecasts also for resource deployment, like cash transfers, food and water, medicine and shelter distribution, and ensure aid for the most vulnerable populations. So these are so critical and so important, but only about half of countries have parts of these systems. So they really need to be expanded, and that's a place that we can see humanitarians supporting. And great, over to you, Billy.
Great, can you hear me okay?
All good.
Amazing. That's a wonderful start. So I was really excited to bring human rights into testing the framework, because right now there's so much going on in the world. There's a lot of conflict, and the humanitarian crises worldwide, they're underfunded, and there is so much going on at the same time. And there's a real need for a concept of, like, I guess, return on investment when it comes to Earth observation data. And I think the human rights case study kind of helps show that in some ways. So to start with, so through this case study and in the guide, as you'll read, I've added kind of 2 little case studies to show kind of a little bit of the breadth of the human rights setting. So this is in terms of context. So the first one is Cameroon. I've worked on the Anglophone crisis in Cameroon for a long time now. And I run a little organization, and effectively we're working with nothing. We're working with any Earth observation data that we can scrounge. We're working with ACLED data, anything we can find. I'm working with volunteers. I'm training them to have the basic skills to perform still really valuable work, but in kind of a limited sense. At the same time, I also worked on the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and in that context, there was so much data. There was a huge amount of expertise, a huge number of organizations doing really impressive, valuable work. And so I find that kind of comparing and contrasting those 2 case studies to be quite, especially in the terms of the pressure testing this guide, to reveal quite a lot about both the guide and also the field itself. So that's me.
All right. Our first question that we'll both take on is, what decisions can satellite data support? And as I mentioned, early warning systems can save lives and reduce economic losses. So how do we do that with satellite data? So first, we can do flood warnings. And in the absence of a full coverage local early warning system, that's always going to be the best. Global systems can help support those and can fill in some gaps as well. So they're not a replacement, but they can assist in providing more coverage to provide data upstream or upwind from local systems coverage. So if you're just using local data, right where storms are coming from, it is incredibly important in flood forecasting. So that's something that satellite data can definitely support with. In addition, there's tools like Google's open building data based on Earth observation that can show where settlements are and populations at risk. This is especially important for newer or less formal settlements, because those are harder to map, and that's where more imagery and real-time data can really support finding those vulnerable populations. We can use satellite data to visualize and understand flood risk and educate in that disaster awareness stage, and support response plans, like through mapping evacuation routes or backup evaluation routes, and supporting key decisions like evacuation or shelter in place in real time. And all of this, the more real time, up to date information is essential in a disaster situation. So, yep. Billy, over to you.
So the use of Earth observation in the human rights field can inform a huge number of decisions, but that is, as the kind of the guide revealed, it's not really equal as I expected, and it's super dependent on the resources of the organization, you, and also I guess those you're trying to influence, your expertise, their expertise, and also your legitimacy and credibility are like hugely important in these contexts, because you could have, through working the guide, I kind of learned that you could have the perfect data that says, for example, an atrocity is going to occur at X place at X time in 3 days' time. And you could hand that to the decision maker and they could totally ignore it because, based on who you are, where you come from. And so the satellite data is only really the start of it. And it kind of helped bring home for me, and hopefully in the guide, that it's the satellite data plus the person. It's the satellite data plus the humanitarian decision maker that obviously makes the decision, but helps steer things hopefully in the right directions. But it can also kind of inform really valuable decisions as an organization itself. So deciding to collaborate with other human rights organizations or media outlets can be a huge step forward. You can use it to launch advocacy campaigns. In theory, you can campaign or push for the deployment of human rights officers or observers to the affected area. I know that was kind of tried in Cameroon a couple of times in different contexts. Moving forward, you can identify hotspots and so on. And so there's an awful lot you can do. There's an awful lot of decisions you can take, but there's so much that goes into that decision beyond just the satellite data in a human rights context.
Great. So the next question was, do precedents exist? And this is, are other humanitarian organizations using this for a similar use case? Have others already stress tested this? What has been their experience? And there's a lot of evidence right now that humanitarian organizations are using flood early warning systems to help people prepare for storms and help people respond. And some global early warning systems, some of their own, some working with governments. So a few really impactful case studies that we found were the World Food Program providing cash transfers ahead of storms. And that really allowed people to evacuate, which is not cheap. Evacuation costs quite a bit of money, especially for the most vulnerable populations and for those without permanent shelter, or there's a lot of risks involved of economic losses too, and not being able to protect your assets. So they were able to provide them with funds and then also food and water and essential items like medicine before the storm, when then that could be more difficult to access. In addition, we saw that the Uganda Red Cross also was able to distribute material and alert residents ahead of the storm. And they were able to build things like protective trenches before a flooding event. And they were using a global flood system called GLOFAST that is referenced in the guide as well. And then in 2020, we saw that the Bangladesh Red Crescent Society also used GLOFAST to prepare residents in advance of the storm with food, water, medicine, and funds for this anticipatory action. So there's quite a bit of precedence of the largest humanitarian organizations in the world doing this successfully. So in terms of the risk to get started, I think that's quite low, but then there's also many considerations along the way that we talk about in the guide to make sure that this follows humanitarian principles and we're cognizant of ethics and risk concerns as well.
So what really excited me about bringing the human rights context case study to the guide is just how kind of broad and varied it is. And so it really, we have all these categories at the left, and I could have given you precedents for each and every single one, numerous examples, all of which I find very exciting and interesting. So everything from disaster response to refugee rights, humanitarian access, environmental justice, accountability and justice, which is often my jam, journalism, conflict and war crimes. There is so much out there, and it's such a kind of excitingly new growing field. I think calling it a new field isn't quite right. I think so. Here I know the Satellite Sentinel project, which did some awesome work back in 2011. So it's not exactly new, but over the past, I want to say 5 years, the field has exploded in so many exciting, wonderful, sometimes not so wonderful ways. And so the number of precedents across each of these categories is so effective in kind of testing and teasing out issues and advantages of the framework and kind of where it might go, where it might go next. I would love to have like a slide on each one, but I was told I couldn't do that. But yeah, so precedents exist. There's a whole load of really exciting work. As a quick comparison here, so we kind of started out with this kind of war crimes work in Sudan, and then the similar in Myanmar. But we've also seen, the use of new technology, which I'll touch on later, thinking about where Ebola could strike next in human rights ramifications of that. And also forensic architecture has done this incredible investigation into like pollution and communities living downwind of a chemical fire. All these things are human rights based and focused, and they're all facilitated by Earth observation now, and that wouldn't have been done. That wouldn't have been done 5 years ago.
So the next question that we have are about the ethical and risk considerations of introducing the use of satellite data. So what are some things that we need to consider for flood early warning systems? And one, I mean, this is quite basic, right? But as accurate as possible. And that's because if it's not conservative enough, or if it's not, we can't have these flood early warning systems be too conservative because of the cost of evacuation. And that for displaced people, right? If everything is around, they have nowhere to store it or protect their assets, that they could lose a lot of their belongings when evacuating or not being able to take that. It's incredibly expensive. Even in the United States, to evacuate Hurricane Harvey costs between $1,500 and $3,000 per family, which a lot of low-income families, even in the US, don't have available. And if they evacuate and there is no reason to, then they're going to lose trust in the system. And then when the next warning comes, they might not evacuate, and then they'll be exposed to the full danger of the storm. So the accuracy, the communication of the accuracy is critical here. In addition, there is a challenge with these systems being accountable to citizens. So oftentimes the government, the meteorological agency of a country or a local municipality is responsible for the warnings. And this is important because that government is accountable to the citizens. When we're talking about global early warning systems, like GLOFAST or even Google Floods, there's not that social contract between the government and the people. So that makes this a little bit challenging because there's not a good system of accountability. So that's something to think about in the implementation here. And another question under this was, does it follow humanitarian principles? So I think it definitely can reinforce humanitarian principles of humanity because, first of all, it can save lives and it can make sure that the most impacted people are getting these warnings. It's impartial, and well, it should be. And these are things that we need to think about, right, when we're creating early warning systems to make sure that the most marginalized communities are included in any warning, and local data, in situ data is also providing information from those marginalized communities, not just the wealthy cities, for example. It can show neutrality because satellite data doesn't see boundaries, really. It doesn't see, different government structures. It can provide information across these different boundaries and making sure that people, regardless of the government structure, are getting this information. And then also, it can be independent because it can be this unbiased source of information. And that's so these are how it follows humanitarian principles. But there's also in our guide many questions along the lines of making sure that we're considering these ethical risks and these humanitarian principles. So, for example, in the guide, you'll see questions like, what is the built environment? Because newer or less formal settlements might not be captured or mapped, and maybe they're not going to, we're going to underestimate the affected populations and send less aid or something of that sort. So making sure that marginalized communities, that less formal settlements are included in any kind of response plan is essential to following these principles too. In addition, things like communication strategies for different groups are really important. Making sure that we're targeting, different levels of literacy, making sure that we're targeting people that have phones, that don't have phones. All of these considerations are incredibly important to make sure that we're following humanitarian principles.
This is probably the topic on the Earth observation use for human rights cases in the human rights context that is probably most important for me, because from personal experience and from my own knowledge, getting this wrong, if you're reporting on a war crime, you're documenting situation, you're collecting data on a group that's fled or a group that's been affected, a community in some way, if you get this wrong, it can kill people. Like, your work can kill people and harm people. And that, to me, I mean, outside of the kind of, I guess, the defense intelligence context, I think that's quite unique. That the field that is trying to probably help individuals the most in terms of human rights is also the one that can take most away and cause the most damage. And this comes up in like so many different ways. I think about vulnerable communities on the ground all the time, and I'm thinking about how that can work. Is it through releasing data? Is it through publishing something? Is it through sharing something? Is it through having your work misused or misattributed on the ground in some way? This for me is extremely important in Cameroon because my organization is pretty much the only game in town in a lot of ways. And so what we do and what we say through like a lot of hard effort and work actually matters. And the international community listens to it, and so do groups on the ground. And so if we get something wrong, it can destroy all of that, and it can destroy all of our work reputationally, but also we know the communities, the conflict is hyper local. It's like a militia per settlement or a militia per 2 militias per like town, right? And so you have to get it right, and we have to be so careful in terms of what we do. A lot of the time it'll mean we report things in very specific ways to limit that harm or limit that risk, or we only share things with totally trusted partners. It doesn't make you a rich, wealthy, influential human rights organization, but it does keep people safe. And from my perspective, in terms of the use of Earth observation data or satellite data in this context, risk and ethics has to be at the heart of it, because there's so much potential for harm if you get that wrong. There are growing different ethical guidelines. There's a few academic articles kind of getting there. Nothing's enough right now, and I'd love to talk, if you want to discuss it, I'd love to talk to you about it, but try and go further than that and think about what really can happen. And then I think I should also note at the end here, so we've seen during the course of creating this guide, like so much has changed, I think, in the human rights Earth observation world. And a particular thing that we kind of theorize for many years, it's kind of theorized that, oh, theoretically, a government could turn off a satellite that is providing data from a specific settlement or conflict. And now it's actually happened. And now we have to reckon with, okay, well, if we're buying imagery from a satellite provider that is totally influenced by the actions of X government, what does that mean about where we're getting the imagery, our coverage, our own risk, our own reliability, and so on? These are all fascinating, really important questions, all of which are critical in the context of using satellite data in this field.
So our next question is, what data can support these decisions and what are must-have requirements for the data and the use case? So for flood early warning systems, I broke these up into the 4 different components of an early warning system. So first is disaster risk knowledge. And humanitarians here can work with the local community so that they properly understand their level of hazards. And how does satellite data help with that, right? So we can incorporate local knowledge of flood hazards with satellite imagery, looking at historical imagery to see where flooding had occurred. We can use digital elevation models to understand better risk, using satellite data to look at buildings or community mapping, and also use satellite data to see evacuation routes, what might be impacted by flood. And this is incredibly important to work with local communities and have local leadership because um, there's so much local knowledge that a humanitarian organization that is not very closely embedded in the community might not have, right? Like, for example, floods might be caused by plastic bags filling up a drainage ditch, and that's something that satellite data can't show us. So understanding that would be where the local knowledge could really, really help. So one example of this that I found really impactful was in partnership with the World Bank. In Mozambique, there's an Institute of Social Communication, and this group educates communities on storm preparedness and response. They have community debates. They distribute educational information, slogan caravans, messages, and bulletins, and messaging on flood risks of major river basins in the country. So that's all done way in advance of even the storm season so that residents are really aware of the dangers of flooding. So the next step is the actual flood forecasting, and local models are often going to be the strongest. Local validated models are going to be very strong, but we can also support these local models with global models where they're not available, or to see more upstream or more upwind than a local model will cover. So 2 examples of those are GLOFAST or Google Flood Hub. And with this, the developers of these models are often always looking for local data. So if there's any local stream flow data or that information, they have a way to send that to them, and then that will make the model even stronger in that location. So we really encourage working with these developers of these models if you're going to use the global models to make the global model stronger, and also for your use case in your specific location to have better and more accurate forecasting. So the next step is this warning, dissemination, and communication. Forecasting a flood perfectly is not going to do anything unless people hear about it and the message receives them in the right way. So this could vary in so many ways, but there's 2 parts that are really important. One is what the message actually says, and then second is how people are receiving it. So for example, there's some people that like to see maps more or graphics. There's some that need different warning levels. So Google Flood Hubs has these different levels of warning, like a warning or an emergency event, and that can really give people a better idea if they need to evacuate. Some places there's just no reception for warnings through technology or radio. So in Mozambique with the World Bank, there are brigades that are trained for in advance of storms. So there was Cyclone Freddy in 2023. That was a massive storm. But these community brigades went out and talked to people face to face to warn them about this coming storm. And that was really helping people who wouldn't receive an alert any other way to move to higher ground. And supported in avoiding loss of life and loss of critical economic belongings, resources. So that's important. Also, certain communities will be will be more receptive to TV alerts, to if that's what what they're doing, what they're watching, to phone calls, to community announcements, and then there's also certain methods that will be received differently from groups like transgender people, women, girls, and elderly. So really understanding what works for those people and what resonates is incredibly important. Okay. And then finally, in terms of response, um, there's a lot of work in forecast-based financing to make sure that people are prepared for the storm. But then there's also storms affect different people differently. So evacuation, and this was a study from Bangladesh, can be really dangerous for girls and women. They might not prefer to leave their homes because first they want to protect their homes and their assets, but then they also may face sexual harassment or assault at shelters. And displaced people too often are more exposed to storms because humanitarian organizations don't always have time or resources to place these camps away from hazard zones. They sometimes have to use whatever land they can. So making sure that displaced people are particularly taken care of in advance of a storm is really important. But at the same time, displaced communities could compete with resources or land or anything from the existing community, so a refugee group. So making sure that the host community also has the same amount of response resources is incredibly important to continue having peaceful existence between refugee communities and local communities that were there before. So there's so many things to consider with this group, and so much social information, so much environmental information, and we try to address those questions in the guide.
So we're seeing a really exciting, I guess, a really exciting and new developing technological landscape, as Ree put it. And in the human rights context, that's massive because we're starting to talk about new capabilities, capabilities that we've only recently gained. And put simply, different human rights issues, having seen how varied they are earlier, you'll understand that they often have, that they have different data needs to work effectively on them or to produce the human rights, I guess, to inform these human rights-based decisions. So from my experience working on conflict documentation and justice and accountability, war crimes, that kind of thing, I always want the highest resolution imagery that's the most recently available as possible. And in Ukraine, that actually can sometimes be achievable. But when I started working in Cameroon, the imagery would be from like so it would be like, say it's 2023, the imagery available publicly was from 2016. New villages and communities had been destroyed or it popped up since the imagery wasn't high quality enough, it wasn't high resolution enough. And that's just kind of been our lot for a long time. But we have seen, by partnering with commercial providers, in my case, we've been able to access much higher frequency, not super high resolution. We're talking about like 0.3 meters a pixel, but still pretty good compared to what we were using before. And the best thing is that kind of frequent orbit is just amazing because it means that I can have an incident, have an incident reported, say a school's been burned down, and I can then go the next day and be like, in theory, I could go the next day and be like, oh yeah, it was burned down. Here's the imagery to prove it, with some degree of resolution and confidence. Of course, working on conflicts in tropical regions, you will know that clouds are the worst thing in the world. They hide everything and make your job a living nightmare. But that's kind of the ideal. But we're also seeing new capabilities, and we're starting to see the field really start to work with them. So we're starting to see people work more with multispectral data. We're starting to see people work with synthetic aperture radar. And that stuff is really, really exciting that's kind of, for me, that might be a little bit of the future. The thing with synthetic aperture radar is that, having just moaned about clouds, in the right context, a synthetic aperture radar sensor and data would be able to look through that and show me what I really want to see. In the context of Cameroon, probably not. But in the context of other serious human rights situations, absolutely. What goes with that, though, you have to think about the cost. And so partnering with commercial partners like Planet means, yeah, we get a 3.7. So we get that kind of we get some medium resolution, we get the high orbit, and it's free, but it comes with strings attached. It isn't their best imagery. And at the same time, like as we've seen, access can be cut off right away, and that is a disaster. And that's why I know there's been some interest in like a humanitarian sovereign satellite capability with some members on the call, which is really interesting. And it kind of remains true that unless you're a really big human rights org and you're like my little Cameroon organization, you can't afford to buy commercial optical satellite imagery. I did it. I bought a $150 image from a Iconos sensor a few years ago, and it was absolutely useless. Because that's how like bad that's how bad like the tasking and data provision stuff, and it was just useless. And we missed a massive. I fixed it later, but we almost missed a massive atrocity because of it. So yeah, we often rely on public data, what's available, scrounging what's around, and that's why ultimately we end up being so kind of beholden to commercial partners and partnering with them.
Yeah, so the next question is, what are your needs for analysis, like cloud computing, internet bandwidth, team time, other expertise, or in-country partners? So for flood early warning systems, and we go into detail in this in the guide, there are mapping technologies or GIS software and imagery analysis that are incredibly important for things like flood extents, where buildings and assets are, where vulnerable populations are, what are evacuation routes, and what are backup evaluation routes. So there's some free options like QGIS or GRASS that you can use. Companies like Esri have low-cost ArcGIS licenses. Google Earth Engine can be used for cloud computing and satellite images, and that can be, I think, used free with for non-commercial use. For imagery, high-resolution imagery, Maxar and Planet Labs have high-resolution data to assist humanitarians to respond to disaster events. And there's an international charter for space and major disasters that task satellites like the 30-centimeter resolution Airbus Pleiades Neo, sorry, might mispronounce that, to assess damage and assist with recovery after disasters. That can provide some technical support too. The UN Emergency Mapping Service for technical support, can provide satellite imagery support and analysis following disasters. And the Humanitarian OpenStreetMap team can organize volunteers to come together online and on the ground to map disaster impacts and understand exactly where those most in need are and most impacted are. So there's quite a few organizations that can provide this technical support. In addition, there's so many trainings out there, and we just list a few, but the International Federation of the Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies have training modules to support humanitarians using early warning systems. NASA Disasters has information on projects that use Earth observation data to support decisions across the disaster cycle. NASA RSET program offers training on satellite-derived data, flood forecasting, and then UN Spider also has a training on flood hazard assessment, and Caribou Space also has a module on geospatial data for flood prevention. So there's so many resources there to get into this. And then finally, on response and forecast-based financing, one particularly informative source was the Red Cross Climate Center's Handbook for Forecast-Based Financing that gives practical guidance on how satellite-derived forecasts can trigger humanitarian action and financing. And yeah, as Seamus is saying, all of these are linked in the guide. So yeah, please do see that.
I'm going to blaze through this because I really want to make sure we have a good decision. Sorry, a good discussion. But one of the key questions I think you have to ask yourselves at the start here in the start of kind of answering this question is how complex your analysis needs, because that's going to totally change everything. If you're after like a Cameroon database of atrocities, war crime documentation, give me 10 volunteers, give me 3 hours. I've got a team that can do functional basic work. Like I can do that. We can train them. We've got that. If you need synthetic aperture radar interpretation, modeling, large scale analysis, that's a totally different thing. That requires partners, that requires real in-house sophistication. I think our needs are similar, but they can also be answered in quite similar ways as well, because the human rights open source field is built on the back of volunteers and on open source technology and on, likes of QGIS and public imagery availability, and frankly, a community that provides and sustains training and investigations and organizations. Volunteers are a huge part of this in kind of the human rights context. I don't know, probably 50% of the existing work using Earth observation data in the human rights context in the past 5 years would not have been achievable without some involvement of volunteers. Looking forward real quick, so I'm excited about new missions coming online and new types of data. I'm fascinated about what they could reveal. I am excited but cautious about AI. I'm seeing a lot of stuff where they're talking about interpreting, processing imagery. Great, but I am always worried about kind of what's left behind, what ends up kind of left in the ether, and how do we assess that? How do we there's a lot of questions to be asked, and I worry the field is so kind of without guide rails. I hope at some point there's like some stop, let's actually think about this. I doubt it, but I like to think so. And finally, I hope that everything's so accessible right now, and it has been. That's central to everything in the field, really. And I hope that comes through in the guide as well, is that it really is that open source community driven nature that makes human rights investigations using satellite data successful. Okay, so I know we've had 3 rounds of thanks. I'm going to be very quick. Firstly, I want to thank everyone here today for your support. Those in our working group, those who we interviewed, others that we consulted and spoke to throughout this process over the past year. It's been wonderful. It would have been far weaker without you, and it is far stronger with you. Secondly, this is the culmination of the Liz and I's fellowship with NASA Lifelines, and I'd just like to say that we are grateful for the trust placed in us by the Lifelines team, and we hope that this today and moving forward repays you in at least a small way. So thank you. It's been an honor and a privilege. Finally, the actual guide. So in our guide, we have sought to bridge the gap between Earth observation and the humanitarian with a pressure-tested framework that makes our Earth observation world accessible and makes real decisions possible. We did not set out in pursuit of perfection. Turns out right away that wasn't going to happen. But we see this as the start. It's a living document that can grow and live on in the hands of you, of our community. I want you to get in touch. I want you to play with it. I want you to test it, build it, share it, help us refine it and break it, frankly, because that means it's being used and that means it's growing and it's doing the things it should do. And so please help unlock those doors for others in the future. And in the time we've been working on this, our world has changed a lot. I know it has for everyone in our field, and I'm sure everyone on the call as well. While this satellite data is only a snapshot in time, we hope that it helps those that need it, including you, see through the noise. Okay, so now we have a discussion question really quick. Okay, so thank you so much for listening. We would love to just I know we don't have much time, but I'd love to hear some response, some reaction, some thoughts. So yes, you've seen the guide, now it's yours. Do you have any thoughts, comments? Are there things you'd like to see, where would you like to see it go next? I'm going to be quiet because I've been talking a lot. Over to you. If you say nothing, I will pick on someone. I'm that person. Jeff, I'm calling on you. So you've kind of seen this. You've kind of seen this in development. How would you hope people would use it in the real world?
Yeah, thanks, Billy. My hope is that, for sort of a new application that you might be considering, I know we had a example from the Q&A here related to sort of groundwater management in refugee camps. And I think like when you have a question like that, using this to sort of break down what steps might I consider or take before I make a choice on whether or not this is an appropriate use. And so I think like my hope is that, anyone who has a question like that can rely on this guide to be able to, guide them through a process that is, vetted by the expertise that we've been able to gather here. And I think also, to explore different use cases. I know that like, Rufi, for example, is going to be working a little bit on sort of GeoAI applications in the humanitarian space. And I think that, this framework is flexible enough to be able to help address those types of questions as well on responsible and effective use, if you extend it a bit as well. So yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing how we might apply this to some other use cases and tell some of those stories that hopefully illuminate the possibilities for other individuals to start down this journey. Over.
Jillian?
Hi, thank you so much for this great presentation and those two case studies. One question I have, and this kind of connects to some of the work that we're doing over at the Signal program, is, one thing we see when working in this space of bridging the gap between the tech side and the practitioner side is really in building the technical capacity, the know-how to do analysis with imagery. And my question is, how is this guide like really what's your approach in terms of addressing that? Like, and teaching someone how to do spatial analysis with imagery is a huge undertaking, and it makes sense to not be able to do that within a framework in and of itself. But my question is, are you maybe making references within the guide for places to go seek out that training? Are you planning on maybe coming out with some of those yourself or referencing something like RSET? Like, how do you approach that gap knowing that you can't fill it within the framework itself?
That's a great question. Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you so much. And I think my first response is that the framework is necessarily limited to kind of where it is at right now. It was focused very much at I guess, that kind of early stage humanitarian decision maker who kind of has their finger in both pots, I guess. But what you're saying is something we were coming across in developing our case studies. Liz and I were both like, well, we could probably have like a human rights version of the framework entirely that could speak to that, and a flooded early warning system version, or I guess an extension of the framework entirely. Because in the frame we do touch on like how these are, and in the case studies we do touch on how these are important things to consider. These are things you should. These are ways you might think about it, or these are ways you might look at it, but we don't get to the question exactly of, okay, how in your specific context should we approach that? But I think that what you're describing is like the perennial problem and in our field, and I think that would be a really valuable extension of this. As we know, satellite data's importance and uptake seems to only be increasing in our field. Does that help at all? It's not really an answer, but it it poses many questions, I guess.
Yeah, it's validating to know that it's a perennial problem, as you said. So I think that's nice to hear. Thank you.
I'm losing track of everyone. Chepu? can't quite hear you. We can't quite hear what you're saying.
Hello. Hello.
Hey.
Hello.
Now we
Hello.
can hear you. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. My name is Shafu. I'm from Niger. Niger, it is in Africa. So I am CEO for enterprise, social enterprise in Haijo. But it is honor for me to assist this webinar. But my question it is which specific training can I follow for help the organization, the local organization in forecasting in flood situation? But it is a specific question. And which satellite, which coverage is available for Niger? Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So in the guide, there are links to the different trainings, and I would refer you to, I mean, there's these 4 different components of the flood early warning system. So I would go through the section in the guide on those different trainings, and we provide links to those to the um, different trainings on different components of flood early warning systems. So some that could be interesting are the RSIT training, the NASA disasters training, and those are all in the guide. But yeah, I think we need to kind of close up now. We hit the hour. So with that, thank you all so much for joining. Seamus, do you want to close us out? I saw you back on camera.
Sure. Just want to echo thanks to, I guess, first and foremost, Liz and Billy for carrying this work forward over the last year, and Rhiannon, of course, as well. And then to everybody in the community that added their expertise and helped us get to this final product, and then everybody on the line today with your curious minds and questions. We really appreciate it and hope to hear more from you. Please don't hesitate to reach out to any of us, to Lifelines, and as I know we're dropped in the Q&A, there's other programs as well. Consider this only an entry point, and this guide is an entry point to NASA Lifelines. Please check us out at nasalifelines.org to see some of the other programs that we're running and how you might be able to get involved and kind of help shape the community. So that's where I'll leave it. Thank you so much for joining. The recording will be posted online for folks to access as well, and please check out the guide. Thank you.
Thanks all.